Dr. Iris Calder had come to the Kestrel Range for exactly 11 days, funded by a small research grant to study high-altitude plant medicine. And she had not expected, on day 4, to nearly die of a heart condition she'd spent 3 years pretending didn't exist. She was 31 years old, a cardiologist herself, which made the irony almost unbearable when she finally admitted it to herself somewhere on the trail above 8,000 feet. The particular arrhythmia she'd been monitoring quietly and managing badly for years, ever since a bout of viral myocarditis in her 20s, had left scar tissue on her heart that no medication had fully resolved. Chose that exact stretch of thin mountain air to finally announce itself as more than a manageable inconvenience. She collapsed on the trail, her heart racing into a rhythm she recognized with clinical horror, even through the haze of her own distress. And the last thing she remembered, before the world narrowed to a gray tunnel, was the sound of footsteps running toward her, fast, and a voice calling out words in a language she didn't recognize. She woke 3 days later, in a room built of stone and timber, wrapped in blankets that smelled of wood smoke and some herb she couldn't identify. Her heart beating with a strange, unfamiliar steadiness that her own medical training told her shouldn't have been possible, given what she remembered of her collapse. The woman who came to check on her, an elder with silver-streaked hair and hands marked by decades of outdoor work, introduced herself as Sella and explained, in careful, accented English, learned from decades of occasional trade contact with the valley below, that Iris had been found by a hunting party from the village of Aranth Hollow, a settlement so remote and so deliberately isolated that it appeared on no official map Iris had ever consulted in preparing for her research trip. "Your heart," Sella said, settling into a chair beside the bed with the unhurried patience of someone entirely unbothered by modern urgency, "was failing. We have seen this before, in others who come to these mountains, carrying old damage they've learned to ignore in the lowlands, where the air makes such ignoring easier. Up here, the thin air finds every weakness a body has been hiding from itself." "You saved my life," Iris said, still working through the disorientation of waking in an unfamiliar place, with her body behaving in ways her medical knowledge couldn't immediately explain. "How? I have a cardiac condition, arrhythmia from scarring after a viral infection years ago. There's no cure for that. Management, medication, sometimes intervention, but not," she gestured vaguely at her own steady pulse, "not this." Sella's expression carried something Iris would spend the following weeks learning to read more precisely. Not smugness, not mystery for its own sake, but the particular patience of someone accustomed to explaining things that sounded impossible to people who'd spent their whole lives inside frameworks that didn't account for what her community understood. "We have practiced healing in these mountains for longer than any record either of our peoples keeps properly," Sella said. "Plants your lowland medicine hasn't cataloged, methods your training doesn't have a name for. I won't pretend our healing works the way your medicine works, with clean mechanisms you could write into one of your journals. But your heart is steady, and it will remain steady, as long as you remain within these mountains and continue the treatment our healers have begun." "As long as I remain," Iris repeated slowly. "You're saying this is conditional, that if I leave—" "Your body carried damage that took years to accumulate," Sella said. "Our treatment addresses the damage as it presents itself here, in this altitude, with the plants and methods available to us. We do not know, with certainty, what happens to that treatment's effects once removed from the conditions that allow it to work. We have seen it hold, in some who left briefly and returned. We have seen it fail entirely, in others who left for longer and did not return in time." Iris absorbed this with the particular vertigo of a physician confronting a treatment paradigm that offered no controlled studies, no peer-reviewed mechanism. Nothing but observed outcomes in a population she had no access to verify, beyond Sella's own careful, unhurried account. Everything in her training told her to be skeptical, to demand evidence, to treat folk medicine claims with the careful, evidence-based distance her profession required. But her own heart, beating with a steadiness she hadn't felt in 3 years of careful, anxious self-monitoring, offered evidence her training had no framework to dismiss outright. She stayed, not immediately out of any decision, so much as a slow, accumulating series of days that never quite arrived at a clear moment for leaving. Her research grant, extended by a sympathetic supervisor, once she explained, carefully, a version of her medical situation that left out the parts she wasn't sure how to explain credibly. The village's healers, continuing whatever careful, patient treatment, kept her heart beating steadily in ways she couldn't fully understand, but could no longer deny. It was during those weeks of treatment and observation, moving slowly through a community she'd initially approached with a researcher's careful, guarded distance, that she met Cale. He was the village's principal healer, a man perhaps her own age, who had trained since childhood in methods Sela described, with evident respect, as considerably more sophisticated than what Iris had initially witnessed in her own treatment. He approached her medical questions not with the defensive mysticism she'd half expected from her limited experience with folk healing traditions elsewhere, but with a careful, systematic curiosity that reminded her, more than she expected, of her own training, a willingness to explain his reasoning, to acknowledge uncertainty where it existed, to engage seriously with her own clinical knowledge rather than dismissing it in favor of unquestioned tradition. "You keep waiting for me to tell you this is magic," he observed, some 3 weeks into her stay, watching her monitor her own pulse with the careful, habitual vigilance of a cardiologist who'd spent years distrusting her own body. "I understand why. Your training gave you a framework where anything outside clinical mechanism gets filed under superstition. But what we do here isn't the absence of mechanism. It's simply mechanism your training never had reason to study. Developed and refined over generations in a population your medical literature has never had access to observe." "Then explain the mechanism," Iris said, more challenge than genuine question, though she found, even as she said it, that she genuinely wanted the answer rather than simply testing him. Cale considered the question with the same careful, unhurried patience she'd come to recognize as characteristic of the village's approach to nearly everything. "Some of it I can explain in terms your training would recognize," he said. "Specific plant compounds, prepared through methods that maximize their bioactive effects, that address inflammation and scarring in ways your pharmaceutical industry hasn't yet isolated or synthesized, because the plants that produce them grow only at this altitude, in conditions your industry has had little reason to study closely. Some of it I genuinely cannot explain to your satisfaction, because we ourselves don't fully understand the mechanism, only the outcome we've observed and refined across many generations of careful practice." It was an honest answer, considerably more honest than Iris had expected, and it did more to earn her trust than any confident claim of understood mechanism could have managed. Over the following weeks, as her research grant stretched from its original 11 days into a month and then 2, she found herself spending increasing time not just as Cale's patient, observing and questioning his treatment methods with a physician's careful skepticism gradually softening into something closer to genuine collaborative curiosity, but simply in his company, drawn by a quality of attention and presence she hadn't experienced in years of a professional life that had left little room for anything beyond her demanding cardiology practice and the careful management of a heart condition she'd told almost no one about. It was nearly 3 months into her stay, well past any reasonable justification her original research grant could offer for her continued presence, when Iris finally allowed herself to acknowledge what had been building, slowly and against every professional instinct she'd spent a career cultivating, between herself and Cale. He had continued her treatment with the same careful, systematic attention he'd shown from their first clinical conversations, and her heart had continued its steady, unfamiliar rhythm, holding stable in ways that still defied every mechanism her own training could fully account for, even after months of careful observation. And at Cale's patient encouragement, her own tentative attempts to document and understand the specific plant compounds and preparation methods involved. But somewhere in those months of daily proximity, of careful conversations that ranged from clinical mechanism to the deeper philosophical questions both of their respective medical traditions grappled with in their own ways, something had shifted that had nothing to do with her cardiac treatment at all. "I need to tell you something," Cale said one evening, as they sat together near the small fire outside her guest quarters, the mountain air cold and clear above them in a way that had become, over months of acclimatization, something closer to comfortable than the disorienting thinness she'd experienced on her first arrival. "Something about how relationships work in Errant Hollow that you should understand before either of us lets this go any further than careful conversation." Iris felt something tighten in her chest that had nothing to do with her cardiac condition. "That sounds like the beginning of a conversation where you tell me this can't happen." "It's the beginning of a conversation where I tell you the truth," Cale said, "and let you decide for yourself what happens next, rather than deciding for you by staying silent." He was quiet for a moment, choosing his words with evident care. "Marriage, in our community, isn't simply a legal or social contract, the way I understand it functions in the lowlands. It carries a ritual significance that goes back further than any of our written or oral records can precisely date. A ceremony that requires what your language would translate, roughly, as a blood sacrifice." Iris went very still, every instinct from a lifetime spent in careful, evidence-based professional culture immediately flagging alarm. "A blood sacrifice," she repeated carefully. "What exactly does that mean, in practice?" "I need you to be specific, Cale, not euphemistic." "I understand why you'd need that," Cale said, meeting her directness with his own. "The ceremony involves a ritual cutting, shallow, deliberate, performed by the village's senior healer, with instruments prepared specifically for this purpose, on both partners entering the marriage. Blood from each partner is combined in a ceremonial vessel, and returned to the earth near the village's central shrine, as an offering that our tradition holds signifies the couple's shared commitment. Quite literally, blood given back to the mountain that has sustained our community for as many generations as anyone can trace. That's not what I'd call a sacrifice, in the sense the phrase usually implies," Iris said slowly, working through the clinical and cultural implications simultaneously. "That sounds like ritual scarification, a ceremonial wound, not," she paused, searching for the right clinical framing, "not something dangerous in itself. Am I understanding you correctly?" "You are," Cale said. "I use the phrase your language would translate to, because I wanted you to understand honestly what the ceremony involves before either of us moved further into something that would eventually require this decision from you. I didn't want you discovering the specific requirement only once you were already emotionally invested enough that declining it would feel like a loss you hadn't fully consented to risk." Iris sat with this for a long moment, her physician's mind working through the practical medical implications, infection risk, scarring, the actual physiological reality of a ceremonial cut performed by someone with, she assumed, considerable practice skill, given the tradition's evident longevity, alongside a more complicated set of questions about what it would mean, for her specifically, to participate in a ritual practice so far outside anything her own cultural and professional background had prepared her to properly evaluate. "Why blood specifically?" she asked, genuinely curious now rather than simply cautious. "What does the tradition understand the ritual to accomplish?" Cale's expression shifted into something more animated, the careful reserve of delivering difficult information giving way to the genuine enthusiasm she'd come to associate with his explanations of the village's medical and cultural practices. "Our tradition holds that blood carries something essential about a person, not metaphorically, in the way your culture sometimes uses bloodline language, but literally. In terms of the specific compounds and markers our healers have learned to read in ways that inform treatment decisions, ancestry tracing, even in some documented cases across generations, early identification of certain hereditary conditions before they fully manifest. The marriage ceremony's requirement isn't simply symbolic sacrifice for its own sake. It's understood, within our tradition, as a genuine exchange of information between partners and between the couple and the community's healers, who witness the ceremony specifically to formally record and understand what each partner's blood reveals about compatibility, about potential hereditary considerations for any children the marriage might eventually produce, about the specific medical history each partner brings into the union. So it's not purely ritual, Iris said, understanding dawning with the particular clarity of someone recognizing a framework that made considerably more clinical sense than the alarming translation she'd initially braced herself against. It's ritual wrapped around what is, functionally, a formalized medical and genetic consultation, conducted by healers with generations of accumulated practical expertise in reading exactly the kind of information your community has learned to extract from blood analysis. Using methods my own training simply doesn't have a framework to properly categorize. I wouldn't claim our understanding maps precisely onto your genetic science, Cale said carefully. But there's real information exchanged, real practical purpose beyond pure symbolism, even if the ceremonial framing carries spiritual significance that goes beyond what your clinical language would capture. Iris found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, considerably more at ease with this fuller explanation than she'd expected to be, given her initial alarm at the phrase, blood sacrifice. Her professional training had taught her to be skeptical of practices that sounded alarming stripped of context, and equally skeptical of practices that sounded exotic or mysterious without proper explanation. But Cale's careful, detailed account offered exactly the kind of contextual grounding that transformed an alarming phrase into something she could actually evaluate on its own terms, weighing genuine practical function against ritual significance in a way that felt considerably more familiar to her own medical background than she'd initially anticipated. "I need time to think about this properly," she said finally. "Not because the ceremony itself alarms me, now that I understand what it actually involves, but because everything you're describing, marriage, staying in these mountains permanently, the treatment that keeps my heart steady only as long as I remain here. This is a considerably larger decision than anything I came here originally prepared to make." "Take whatever time you need," Cale said. "I'd rather you arrive at this decision with full understanding and genuine certainty than rush towards something you haven't properly considered, simply because the alternative, leaving, and risking whatever happens to your heart's treatment once you're gone, feels urgent in a way that might pressure you toward a choice you wouldn't otherwise make." The weeks that followed brought a period of careful, deliberate consideration that Iris approached with the same systematic rigor she'd have applied to any major clinical decision in her professional life. Consulting, as thoroughly as the village's isolation allowed, with Sela and several other elders about the marriage tradition's history and practical outcomes across generations. Observing, with her physician's careful attention, several other couples in the village whose marriages had followed exactly the ceremony Cale had described. Cross-referencing what she learned against her own accumulating understanding of the village's broader medical and cultural practices, which had, over her months of residence, proven considerably more sophisticated and internally consistent than her initial, uninformed assumptions had anticipated. She learned, through these careful weeks of investigation, that the tradition Cale had described carried a depth of practical function that went considerably beyond even his initial explanation. The village's healers, she discovered through careful conversation with Sela and two other senior practitioners, maintained detailed records, not written in any form Iris immediately recognized, but preserved through an oral and symbolic recording tradition passed down through generations of trained healers, documenting the blood analysis performed during marriage ceremonies across the village's history. Information that had allowed the community, over generations of careful observation, to identify and manage hereditary health considerations with a precision that Iris, evaluating the outcomes with her own clinical training, found genuinely impressive, despite the absence of any framework her own medical education had prepared her to properly categorize. "You're describing a functional genetic counseling tradition," she told Sela during one of these careful investigative conversations, developed independently of anything my own field's history documents, refined across generations of careful practical observation rather than the kind of controlled research methodology my training relies on, but achieving, as far as I can evaluate the outcomes you're describing, remarkably similar practical results. We would not claim to understand what your science understands about the specific mechanisms involved, Sela said, with a particular careful humility Iris had come to recognize as characteristic of the village's most experienced healers, who seemed consistently more interested in accurately representing the limits of their own understanding than in claiming mystical authority beyond what their practical experience actually supported. We understand what generations of careful observation have taught us works in terms of outcomes, without always understanding precisely why it works in the mechanistic terms your training would require. It was during this period of careful investigation that Iris also confronted, with the same systematic honesty she brought to every other aspect of the decision, the deeper personal question underlying the practical and cultural considerations. Whether she genuinely wanted the life this decision would require, not simply as a continuation of the cardiac treatment that had initially brought her into the village's care, but as a considered, independent choice about the actual life she wanted to build, with a man she had, over months of careful proximity, come to care for in ways that went considerably beyond gratitude for his medical care. She thought during those weeks about the life she'd be leaving behind in the lowlands, a demanding cardiology practice she'd built over years of careful professional cultivation, a small circle of colleagues and friends who knew almost nothing of the cardiac condition she'd spent years carefully hiding from them, a family relationship with her own parents that had grown distant over years of her own careful, professional self-sufficiency. She thought, too, about what she'd found in the months since her collapse on that mountain trail, not simply a treatment that kept her heart steady, but a community whose careful, systematic approach to medicine and knowledge had challenged and expanded her own professional understanding in ways she hadn't experienced since her earliest years of medical training, and a man whose patient, honest partnership in that expanding understanding had become, gradually and almost without her fully noticing the transition, one of the central relationships of her adult life. "I've been approaching this like a clinical decision," she told Cale, nearly 6 weeks after his initial explanation of the marriage tradition, sitting together again near the same fire where the conversation had first begun. "Weighing evidence, evaluating outcomes, treating it like a treatment protocol I needed to properly assess before consenting to it. But that's not actually the question in front of me, is it? The medical information exchange, the practical function of the ceremony, that's real, and I've satisfied myself it's legitimate. But the actual decision isn't about whether the ceremony makes clinical sense. It's about whether I want this life. Whether I want you, specifically, not as the healer who saved my life, but as a partner, for whatever years I have left to live it." "And what have you decided?" Cale asked, watching her with the careful, patient attention she'd come to recognize as fundamental to who he was, professionally and personally both. "I've decided," Iris said, "that I've spent my whole adult life treating my own heart as a liability to be carefully managed and hidden, something that made me fundamentally different from the people around me, in ways I never let myself fully process or grieve. You didn't just treat that condition medically. You made me feel, for the first time in years, like the damage in my heart wasn't something I needed to hide to be worthy of a full life. I want this. Not because my cardiac treatment requires it, though I won't pretend that consideration is entirely absent from my thinking. I want it because somewhere in these past months, without fully realizing when it happened, I fell in love with you, and with a way of understanding medicine and knowledge that's expanded everything I thought I knew about my own profession." The marriage ceremony, when it finally took place some months later, unfolded with a careful, deliberate solemnity that Iris found herself approaching with genuine reverence, rather than the clinical detachment she might once have expected from herself. Sela presiding as the village's senior healer, the ceremonial cutting performed with a precision and gentleness that spoke to generations of careful, practiced skill. The combined blood offered to the earth near the village's central shrine, in a ritual that carried for Iris a weight of meaning that went considerably beyond the practical medical information exchange underlying its ceremonial form. The years that followed brought Iris a life she could not have imagined for herself during those first careful evidence-gathering weeks of her original research trip. A life that gradually integrated her own clinical training with the accumulated practical medical knowledge of a community whose isolation had, she came to understand more fully with each passing year, protected and refined generations of genuinely sophisticated practice that her own field's institutional structures had never had the opportunity to properly study or incorporate. She and Cale established over the years following their marriage a careful collaborative practice that drew on both traditions, her own clinical training bringing diagnostic tools and pharmaceutical knowledge the village's traditional methods had never had access to. Cale's generations of accumulated practical expertise bringing plant-based treatments and observational methods that Iris's own training had never properly credited or studied. Their combined practice, treating not only the village's own residents, but increasingly a small trickle of patients from the lowlands who learned, through careful word of mouth, of treatments unavailable through conventional medical channels, became something neither of their individual traditions could have produced alone. "I used to think," Iris told a visiting medical researcher some years into this collaborative practice, a former colleague from her old cardiology practice, who had traveled to the mountains at Iris's own careful, deliberate invitation, hoping to build exactly the kind of respectful, collaborative bridge between traditions that her own marriage had come to represent. That evidence-based medicine and traditional practice existed in fundamental opposition. That taking one seriously required dismissing the other. What I've learned here is that the opposition was never real. It was a limitation of my own training's institutional structures, which had simply never developed the tools or the humility to properly study traditions like this one on their own terms, rather than dismissing them wholesale or exoticizing them into meaningless mysticism. Their own children, born in the years following their marriage, grew up in a household that moved fluidly between both traditions, trained from an early age in both the plant-based observational methods Cale's own childhood training had instilled in him, and the clinical, evidence-based framework Iris continued to bring from her own medical background, a synthesis that neither of their individual traditions had fully anticipated, but that both, increasingly, came to recognize as genuinely valuable in its own right. Iris's cardiac condition, monitored carefully across the years through both traditions' methods, remained stable in ways that continued to defy any mechanism her own original training could fully explain. Though the years of collaborative practice with Cale and the village's other healers had, at least, given her considerably more sophisticated language for describing and partially understanding the specific plant compounds and treatment methods involved, even as some elements of the practice's full mechanism remained by mutual acknowledgement beyond what either tradition's current understanding could completely explain. She thought often, in quieter moments across those years, about the particular strangeness of her own path into this life. A collapse on a mountain trail that had nearly killed her, a treatment tradition she'd initially approached with every reflexive skepticism her professional training had instilled, a marriage ceremony framed, in its initial explanation, in terms alarming enough that she might easily have refused to properly investigate its actual practical meaning before understanding what it genuinely involved. "Do you ever wonder," she asked Cale one evening, years into their marriage, watching their two children practice plant identification with the same careful, systematic attention Cale had once brought to explaining his own healing methods to her, "what would have happened if I'd simply reacted to that first alarming phrase, blood sacrifice, without staying long enough to understand what it actually meant? I could have left, returned to the lowlands, accepted whatever risk that carried for my heart, avoided this entire life out of an understandable but ultimately misinformed fear. I chose to explain it as honestly and directly as I did, even knowing the initial phrase would alarm you, because I understood that any relationship built on softening or hiding that initial alarming truth would eventually fail once you learn the full context on your own terms, likely in circumstances less controlled and less trusting than the conversation we actually had. I'd rather risk you leaving, informed and clear-eyed about exactly what you were choosing to walk away from, than keep you here through a partial truth that would eventually collapse under its own incompleteness. Nearly 10 years after that first collapse on the mountain trail, Iris stood at the edge of Aranth Hollow's central gathering space, watching her own eldest daughter, 12 years old and already showing the careful, systematic curiosity that marked both her parents' respective medical traditions, assist Sella, now elderly, her once silver-streaked hair gone fully white, but still sharp in her careful, patient attention to detail, in preparing herbs for a treatment that combined, in ways that had become simply ordinary practice for the village over the years of Iris and Kale's collaborative work, both traditional plant knowledge and the clinical preparation standards Iris's own training had brought into the village's evolving practice. The research center they'd eventually established, drawing on the careful, respectful collaborative model Iris had first envisioned during those early years of her own investigation into the village's medical traditions, had grown, over the following decade, into something neither she nor Kale could have fully anticipated when they'd first begun the careful work of building genuine bridges between their respective traditions. A small but growing body of published research, conducted always with the village's full consent and collaborative authorship, documenting plant compounds and treatment methods that had, in several cases, gone on to inform legitimate pharmaceutical development in the lowlands, always with careful attribution and benefit-sharing agreements that Iris had insisted on from the earliest stages of the collaboration, determined that her own community's traditional knowledge would never be extracted and exploited in the way she'd seen happen historically to other traditional medical systems around the world. "I think about that first conversation often," she told her daughter one evening, the two of them walking together along the same mountain trail where Iris had originally collapsed a decade earlier, now marked with a small, carefully maintained shrine that the village had built, at Kale's own quiet initiative, to commemorate the site where the community's careful, patient healing tradition had first intersected with the outside world in a way that had ultimately proven mutually enriching for both traditions. "Your father told me, very honestly, that marriage here required what sounded, in the moment, like something genuinely alarming, a blood sacrifice." I nearly panicked, hearing those words, before I understood what they actually meant. "But you stayed long enough to understand," her daughter said, with the particular clear-eyed directness Iris had come to recognize as characteristic of a childhood spent moving fluidly between two traditions that had each, in their own way, valued careful, patient investigation over reflexive assumption. "I stayed long enough to understand," Iris agreed, "because your father was honest with me from the very beginning, even knowing that honesty might cost him the relationship he was hoping to build. He trusted me to handle difficult, unfamiliar truth better than he trusted a comfortable, softened version of it. That trust, more than the treatment that saved my heart, more than anything else about this whole unlikely life I built here, is what actually made me fall in love with him." They walked together in comfortable silence for a while, the mountain air cold and clear around them in the way that had become, over a decade of acclimatization, simply the ordinary texture of Iris's daily life, rather than the disorienting thinness she'd experienced on her very first arrival. "I used to think," she said eventually, "that the biggest risk in coming here was medical, that I was gambling my heart on a treatment I couldn't fully verify by my own profession's standards. But the real risk, the one that actually mattered, was letting myself trust something I didn't fully understand yet, long enough to actually understand it properly, instead of retreating into the comfortable skepticism my training had taught me to default to whenever something looked unfamiliar or alarming on its surface." She glanced at her daughter, watching the careful, thoughtful way the girl absorbed this reflection. Already, Iris suspected, turning it over against her own growing understanding of both traditions she was being raised within. That's the only advice I really have for you about whatever unfamiliar and alarming things you'll eventually encounter in your own life, wherever it eventually takes you, whether that's staying here in these mountains or someday choosing a life beyond them. Stay curious long enough to understand something properly before you decide whether to be afraid of it. Below them, the village continued its quiet, ordinary evening rhythms. Healers preparing the next day's treatments, families gathering for evening meals, the accumulated knowledge of countless careful generations continuing its patient work of teaching and healing, now woven through Iris's own decade of careful collaborative effort into something that honored both the tradition that had saved her life and the clinical rigor that had shaped her own before she'd ever set foot on that mountain trail 10 years and an entire unexpected life ago.